In late 1942, a German tank unit was parked in reserve on the grasslands outside Stalingrad. 104 tanks, held back from the front, waiting. When the order finally came and they were desperately needed, fewer than 20 of them started. They hadn't been shelled, they hadn't run out of fuel. During those quiet weeks sitting still, field mice had nested inside the vehicles and eaten the insulation off the electrical wiring. The most advanced war machine on the planet was stopped by mice. Here's the reality. Nothing ever fails the way you planned for it to fail. And that one sentence is the reason the smartest looking money strategy is almost always the most fragile one. Right now, there's a calculator somewhere telling you that the cash sitting in your account is dead money. It earns nothing. It loses to inflation every year. By every measure of efficiency, it's a mistake. That cash might be the most valuable thing you own. Because efficiency is a bet that nothing surprising happens. And in the next 15 minutes, you'll learn why that's the one bet that is never paid off, why being exactly right is more dangerous than being roughly right, and what the word inefficient is actually hiding. This is chapter 13 of The Psychology of Money, and it's the chapter that keeps you in the game. Benjamin Graham, the man who taught Warren Buffett, built his entire method on one idea: the margin of safety. If you work out that a business is worth $100 a share, don't pay 99, pay 60. Not because you think you're wrong, because you might be. And here's the line that makes it click. The purpose of the margin of safety is to render the forecast unnecessary. Hear that as a life instruction and not a stock instruction. It says the goal was never to predict better. The goal is to build something that doesn't need the prediction to be right. But if my numbers are correct, that margin costs me money. Yes, that's exactly what it is. You're not losing that money, you're spending it. You're buying the right to be wrong without being finished. And most people never realize that right is for sale. Housel calls it room for error, and it might be the most underrated force in all of finance. Card counting in blackjack genuinely works. Track what's been dealt, and the odds tip slightly in your favor. That part is real. Here's what almost nobody knows about it. As one member of the famous MIT blackjack team put it, counting can shift the odds in your favor, and you can still go broke if you bet too much. Sit with that for a second, because this is the part that has nothing to do with cards. Your edge is an average. Your life happens in a sequence, and a sequence doesn't care about your average. A slight edge over 1,000 hands is worth absolutely nothing if the first 10 hands take your whole stack. That's the risk nobody plans for. Not being wrong. Being right in the wrong order. So the skill was never the counting. Counting is the easy part. The skill is bet sizing. Never putting down more than you can survive being unlucky with. But I've done the research. I'm confident. Confidence is about whether you're right. Bet sizing is about what happens if you're not. Those are two completely separate questions, and only one of them can bankrupt you. Being right is worth nothing if you're not around for the payoff. Now back to the tanks, because the mice are the entire point. Every risk you can name, you've already handled. You know about job loss. You know about market crashes. You've thought about them, which is exactly why they're not what gets you. What gets you is the thing that was never in the model. The mice. The car and the boiler in the same month. The client who takes 90 days to pay. The family emergency in a country you weren't planning to fly to. That's why room for error can't be built risk by risk. You can't list them in advance. You have to build a buffer that doesn't care what the reason turns out to be. And here's the biggest single point of failure with money, according to Housel. Relying entirely on a paycheck to cover short-term needs, with no savings creating a gap between what you think your expenses are and what they could turn out to be. One income, zero buffer, full calendar. That's 104 tanks and one nest of mice. Now let's deal with the word that started all of this: efficiency. Efficiency means removing slack. Every unused resource gets converted into something productive. It sounds obviously correct, and every unit of slack you remove is a quiet bet that nothing unexpected is coming. Think about a hospital running at 100% occupancy. On paper, perfect. In reality, it has no capacity to absorb one bad night. The empty bed isn't waste. The empty bed is the product. Your cash is the empty bed. But cash loses to inflation. It does, and I'm not going to pretend that isn't real. Inflation takes a few $100s a year off a decent buffer quietly forever. That's the fee. But notice what kind of fee it is. It's small, it's constant, and it arrives monthly, which is precisely why it feels expensive. The thing it protects you from is enormous, rare, and arrives once. Human beings are catastrophically bad at comparing those two shapes, and the entire financial industry is built on that failure. So in a second, I'm going to put a number on both, and I'm going to do it honestly, which means the number that hurts my own argument goes first. But that's the easy version, and I don't want to sell you the easy version. Nobody argues about an emergency fund. Everyone agrees with an emergency fund. The contested claim, the one in the title, is holding more cash than the advice says you should deliberately for years. So let's be honest about what that actually costs, because most videos on this won't be. Say you keep an extra $20,000 in cash for 30 years instead of investing it at 7%. That single decision costs you around $130,000. That's not a rounding error. That's a deposit on a house. So you're telling me to lose $130,000. I'm telling you what it costs, which is more than the spreadsheet told you and more than most people making this argument will admit. Now the other side of the ledger, because that's the part everyone leaves as a feeling. Same person, no buffer. Year 11, the market falls 35%, and something goes wrong at exactly the wrong moment. So the $50,000 you had invested gets sold at 32.5. Left alone, that $50,000 would have been worth about $180,000 by year 30. If you get back in 2 years later, once things feel safe, you land around 103. If you're one of the people who never quite gets back in, you're at 32. So that single forced sale costs you somewhere between $78,000 and $148,000, depending only on how long you stay frightened. $130,000 to hold the buffer, against $78 to $148 for the one event the buffer exists to prevent. That's the real trade, with both sides priced, and it only has to happen once. And that's the version where you only lose money. It doesn't include the job you couldn't leave or the year you spent making decisions from a position of fear, both of which cost real things that don't appear on any statement. Housel has a line here worth memorizing. The most important part of every plan is planning on your plan not going according to plan. Here's how that becomes practical. Every retirement calculator asks you to assume an average annual return, and people type in the historical number because why wouldn't they? Now flip it. Build the plan on a lower number than you expect. Plan for 4% and get 8, and you arrive early and delighted. Plan for 8 and get 4, and you're 62 years old and starting again. Same uncertainty, completely different consequences. That asymmetry is the whole argument. Isn't that just pessimism? No. Pessimism says it won't work. This says it will probably work, and I'd like to also be fine in the version where it doesn't. Those are not the same sentence. The gap between what you assume and what you actually need is where your room for error lives. Now the distinction that decides everything. Some risks set you back, some risks take you out. They are not on the same scale, and treating them like they are is how careful people get destroyed. A setback costs you time. Ruin costs you the ability to keep playing. You can recover from any number of setbacks. You cannot recover from one ruin, because recovering requires you to still be in the game. In 1998, a hedge fund called Long-Term Capital Management demonstrated this at a scale nobody has forgotten. Its staff included Nobel Prize winners and traders with hundreds of millions of dollars of their own money inside the fund. The models were sophisticated. The positions were, broadly, reasonable. And they had borrowed so heavily that a market which merely behaved unusually, not impossibly, just unusually, erased them in a matter of weeks. They weren't wrong about very much. They were wrong about how much room they had left themselves. Most bets don't fail because the idea was wrong. They fail because the idea was mostly right in a situation that needed it to be exactly right. So here's what all of this is actually protecting. Compounding needs one thing more than any other, and it isn't high returns. It's time that never gets interrupted. A decent return for 50 uninterrupted years is a preposterous outcome. A spectacular return for 10 years, followed by a wipeout, is just a story people tell. So the question stops being what's the highest return I can get and becomes what return can I earn while guaranteeing I'm still standing in 30 years? Those two questions have very different answers, and almost everybody optimizes for the first one. But I'll miss the upside, some of it, and the person taking maximum risk misses all of it in the 1 year that ends him. Room for error isn't a defensive crouch, it's the thing that buys you the years in which compounding actually happens. Endurance isn't the boring part of the strategy. Endurance is the strategy. So, what does that make you? A contradiction, and deliberately so. Housel describes it as a barbell personality, optimistic about the long run future and paranoid about the things that will stop you reaching it. Most people can only hold one of those at a time. The pessimist protects himself out of every opportunity he'll ever get. The optimist assumes it works out, skips the buffer, and gets removed by the first thing he didn't imagine. That's a contradiction. It's the only combination that survives. Save like the worst case is coming. Invest like the world keeps improving. Both are true statements about the same future. One is about the destination, the other is about the road. The paranoia is what buys the optimism enough time to be right. 4 things, and none of them are complicated. The first is to write down the gap, what you think your monthly expenses are, and what they'd be in a genuinely bad month, the boiler, the flight, the deductible, all in the same 30 days. The distance between those two numbers is the buffer you're currently missing. The second is to hold an amount of cash that feels slightly embarrassing, and to size it by how unstable your income is, not by a rule. Salaried, one earner, specialized industry, or self-employed? The standard 3 to 6 months is thin, and closer to a year is the honest number. 2 stable incomes in a field that's always hiring? 6 months genuinely is enough. Either way, if the figure makes you wince a little, that's the signal you've got it about right, because that wince is the fee for never being forced to sell anything at the worst possible moment. The third is to clear out any debt whose repayment depends on your assumptions being correct. Not all debt. The debt that only works if the income holds, the tenant stays, the market cooperates. That's the debt that converts a setback into a ruin. And the fourth is to assume lower returns than history handed you. Not because the future is bleak, but because a plan that only works at the historical average is a plan with no room in it. One exception to all of it. If your employer matches retirement contributions, take the full match before you build anything. That's not optimizing. That's declining free money. Efficiency is a bet that nothing surprising happens. Room for error is a bet that something will. Only one of those bets has ever been right. The cash sitting there looking lazy isn't underperforming. It's doing a completely different job. The job of making sure everything else you own never has to be sold on the worst day of the year. Remember this, your buffer decides what you can survive. What you survive decides how long you last. And how long you last is the only thing compounding has ever cared about. So start small. Work out what one genuinely bad month costs you, not an average month, a bad one, and hold that number in cash before you optimize anything else. It'll look inefficient on paper. That's how you'll know it's working.